He woke to the weight first, a gentle pressure across his chest, warm and alive, and for a split second his hand went for the knife beneath his pillow. The cabin was quiet except for the pop of dying embers and the soft rush of breath that wasn't his own. When he opened his eyes, the world narrowed to a pair of dark eyes hovering inches from his face, wide with alarm and something else he couldn't name. Her hair spilled like night over his shoulders, and the scars on her cheek caught the firelight. She froze when she saw he was awake, every muscle coiled to flee, and in that instant he understood that whatever had brought her here had taught her fear long before it taught her trust. "Easy," he said, voice rough with sleep and caution. He loosened his grip on the knife and raised his empty hand so she could see it. "You're safe." The word safe sounded thin even to him. Nothing was safe on the high plains in winter, not for a man alone, and certainly not for a woman who bore the marks of running. She swallowed, her gaze flicking to the door, to the window, to the corners of the room as if expecting shadows to rise. Then she slid off him in a rush, landing light on her feet. He sat up slowly, giving her space, his heart still thudding. The night before came back in pieces. He'd found her at dusk, collapsed near the creek with blood on her sleeve and fever in her eyes. He'd debated leaving her, not because he lacked kindness but because kindness could be fatal. In the end he'd carried her anyway, because there are moments when a man's choice defines him more than his fear. He'd cleaned the wound, fed her broth, and stayed awake until the fever broke. At some point he'd slept. At some point she'd woken. "I didn't mean," she began, then stopped. English came to her like a borrowed coat, serviceable but heavy. She touched her own chest, then his, as if mapping the distance between them. "Night. I thought. Dreams," he said. "They get loud out here." She nodded, relief loosening her shoulders a fraction. "I am called Ayanna." "Caleb," he answered. He didn't offer his last name. Names could be anchors or chains, depending on who held them. She wrapped her blanket tighter and perched on the edge of the bed, keeping a careful distance. In the firelight he saw how young she was, old enough to have known loss, too young to have known peace. He noticed the way her hands trembled when she reached for the cup he offered, the way she watched his eyes more than his hands. It told him what words did not. When the sun rose, pale and unforgiving, the truth began to surface. Ayanna was Apache, from a band that had scattered after soldiers burned their winter camp. She had been taken by men who called it protection and treated it like ownership. She had escaped in the night, running until her lungs burned and her strength left her. The wound on her arm was from a fence she'd torn through, barbed wire biting deep. She spoke of her people as if they were both memory and promise, something she held inside because she could not hold it anywhere else. Caleb listened. He had learned long ago that listening was an act of courage. He did not interrupt, did not offer solutions too quickly. When she finished, the cabin felt fuller, heavier, like it had absorbed her story into the grain of its walls. "You can stay until you're strong," he said. "Then I can take you to the agency, or wherever you need to go." Her eyes sharpened. "Agency means soldiers." "Not always," he said. "But I won't force you." She studied him the way a tracker studies ground, reading signs invisible to the careless. "Why did you help me?" He thought of his wife's laughter before fever took it, of the empty place at the table, of the way the plains could hollow a man if he let them. "Because I could," he said. "And because nobody helped my wife when she needed it." The days that followed found their rhythm. She healed, slow and stubborn. He worked the land and she watched, then joined him, learning his routines while teaching him hers. She cooked with herbs he'd never used, sang softly while mending, and spoke to the horses in a language that made them calm. At night they shared stories by the fire, careful at first, then braver. The memory of waking beneath her faded into something less startling and more tender, a reminder of fear turned into trust. Trouble did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived as dust on the horizon and the sound of hooves where no hooves should be. Men came asking questions, smiling too wide, their eyes skimming the cabin like hands. Caleb felt the old calculations rise in him. What he owed the law, what he owed himself, what he owed the woman who slept beneath his roof. Ayanna knew them. She recognized the way they rode, the way they looked at her as if she were already claimed. That night she did not sleep. When Caleb woke, she was sitting at the table, knife laid out before her, spine straight. "They will come back," she said. "For me." Caleb stood with the truth. "They'll have to go through me." She shook her head. You don't know who I am. He waited. My father is a chief, she said. The words trembled, not with pride but with weight. If they find me here, they will say you took me. They will bring soldiers. The cabin seemed smaller then, the world pressing in. Caleb felt the fear he'd tried to bury stir and breathe. I don't care who your father is, he said. I care who you are. Her eyes shone, and for a moment she reached for him, then stopped, as if remembering every line that should not be crossed. You are a good man, she said softly. Good men pay. The men returned at dawn, louder, bolder. Words were exchanged. Hands hovered near guns. When one of them reached for Ayanna, Caleb moved. The fight was quick and brutal and ended with blood in the dust and the men retreating with threats that promised more than they delivered. Afterward, Caleb leaned against the fence, breath ragged. Ayanna pressed a cloth to his cut, hands steady despite the storm in her eyes. You should let me go, she said. Now, he knew she was right. He hated it anyway. I'll take you myself, he said. To your people. The journey was hard. Snow fell early, and the land tested them with cold and hunger. They argued, laughed, shared silence that felt like home. One night, when the fire burned low and the stars spilled like salt, Ayanna told him what it meant to belong to a people, to be known by a land that knew you back. Caleb told her about choosing to stay when leaving might have saved his heart. They sat close, warmth shared, boundaries respected, something unspoken growing between them that was more than want. When they reached the place where her band had gathered, wary eyes watched from the trees. Ayanna stepped forward alone, spoke words that made the tension break like ice in spring. Her father came, older than Caleb expected, his gaze sharp and measuring. He looked at Caleb for a long time. You saved my daughter, the chief said. And you did not claim her. Caleb nodded. She claimed herself. There was a pause, then a smile that carried sorrow and respect. You are welcome here. Caleb did not stay. He knew how stories could twist if he did. He returned to his cabin with the ache of absence and the quiet pride of having chosen right. Winter deepened. He worked. He remembered. When spring came, Ayanna returned. She rode alone, strong and sure, a woman who had run and returned on her own terms. She dismounted and stood where she had once been carried. I wanted you to know, she said, that I am free. He smiled, and the world felt wider. They stood together in the open, not bound by fear or debt, choosing the next step because it was theirs to choose. And in that choosing, Caleb understood that rescue is not the moment someone lifts you from the ground, but the moment you are seen as whole and allowed to stand.